Okay, I'll begin the second video on the banks in Almaghadi, if that's how you say the name. Readings. Apologize for the length of the first one. I was trying to do some things different, and I knew I couldn't do both, and so. But I guess I got off on a tangent or two. But I think it'll help frame some things for you. So, and it definitely comes out of this idea that, of trying to learn from the readings, but also ask questions about the readings. So this video will be a bit more straightforward, coming out of key points in the two readings. So let me share the screen. Hopefully this will work right. There we go. Yes. So this is kind of the second half. So we'll begin with banks and what he calls misconceptions. About multicultural education. So one of the misconceptions is that, and I've got this a little backwards, but is that multicultural education is somehow or another ethnic or gender specific. It is not. It is meant to provide a curriculum for all students. And the literature, whether this gets applied in the same way or not, the literature seems to be pretty clear that the learning goals are the same across the board. We do differentiate, which we'll talk about in a minute, a little bit. But we want all students to learn. So we're kind of back to Whitehead's quote there. So one of the ways that we can provide curriculum for all students is through what is called culturally responsive curriculum. So that you use materials that represent a cross-section of your students. I actually introduced this idea to Nichols back in 2001. The second or third semester I was here, as we had to get ready for NCATE and develop our own conceptual framework. And what I presented was teaching from the local. And that's based upon culturally responsive curriculum. So using the knowledge that's, as much as you can, the knowledge that students already know from their nature, right? From their everyday life, to teach, the concepts that the curriculum, the standards are trying to teach. So for me, this is nothing new. And it's, I think, a way to, capture students' interest um, by talking about the things that they're familiar with and showing the connections and the relationships. And for my social studies students that are out student teaching, and when I do teach methods, um, this is a big part of what I try to move them towards. And often wonder, well, you're teaching this historical concept, this historical um, event, and why didn't you use this example, you know, from Louisiana, from our environment, from our history, okay, that are connected to these things. So, in a way, it's being smarter than the curriculum, and I think this is true of all culturally responsive um, curriculum ideas. Okay. Um, One of the misconceptions is that somehow or another it's against the Western tradition. So, um, well, that's a misunderstanding of the Western tradition, I think. And I guess I talked about that a little bit in the first video. My personal experience is I opted out of American and British Lit in high school. I was too ignorant to, in a way, I was too ignorant to understand the things I should have understood. But instead I took world literature, which was one of the other options at my high school. So I read for that class, that's that English, in English, literature is all written and read in English. I read non-Western authors. I heard stories about important people, both male and female, who were neither Anglo nor American. And through that education, I learned that no matter where we are from, we mostly share common values of family, romance and courtship. So we read haiku and Chinese love poetry. Still have a book of that. So some of the most romantic poetry I've ever read, right, is Chinese love poetry. So also values of hard work and respect for life. So we read, African poets. We read Latin poets. We read the ancients. And we read Don Quixote. So, a lot of, non-traditional, English or American literature, British or American literature. And Banks, I think, makes an important point that when we read certain authors, particularly African-American authors and some others, that they're still coming out of what is called the Western tradition. They're often pointed to as being somehow post-colonial. You may be familiar with that term or not. And I would argue that Southern literature post-Civil War, in a way, is post-colonial. I've never had any post-colonial theorists take me up on that, um, but anyway, so you know, so it's pretty clear we can open up the canon to include authors that some of our students will better identify. Although I love Shakespeare, and I think students should read Shakespeare, because in the end of the day, we're still primarily English speakers. That's our language, but like any language, that language is changing. But we can get a sense through Shakespeare about how language changes, because Shakespeare changed the language, changed the way people spoke. And I think that, that's something that's important for our students to understand, for instance. The other misconception that it divides the country. And I would argue we're already divided. Our politics is meant to divide us to a certain extent. This, if you go through our history, we're politically divided constantly. I think the period just prior to and just after the Second World War, into the 1970s. So from let's say 32, 36, I don't know. So 36 to 72, I think we lived it in a unique period. But the two things that appeared to unite us through that period was the common experience of the Depression and the Second World War, and to some degree, the beginnings of the Cold War. But if, as I'm arguing above, that we have these shared values, then I don't see how a culturally responsive curriculum divides us. Okay, because we can all learn how to be, again, it's Whitehead's call. We can all learn to live a better life through all sorts of materials. Okay. And again, the question is, how do we best attain community? And I really think we can be well served about how others think about community, because I don't know if we understand what that term means anymore. Because most of our relationships, rather than being communal relationships, are associative. I don't think that Facebook is a community per se. I would argue, it have a couple of theorists that I think who talk about community in the 20s have a better understanding of that, because most of our relationships aren't deep, particularly for generations that are involved in what is called a hookup culture. How does one attain community that way? True community. Anyway, and of course that concept of true can be loaded. But one of the things that we need to do, and any number of literatures can do this for us, is provide students with both empathy and hope. Okay. And I would argue to you cannot learn from another unless you have empathy. Okay. The whole point of a good novel is it generates some type of empathy. And I think that's true of any media. So, and the other idea is hope. And hope to me comes in two forms. Um, one is social hope, or if you rather, economic hope. The other is spiritual hope. And I think there is a loss of hope, both spiritually and socially. Um, and this greatly concerns me. And we see, so as teachers, I think it's important for us to help our students empathize and find hope. So down here I have me. This is just another thought that came out of this idea of divide the country. And it's a rhetorical question. Don't expect an answer. But how can a compulsive system of schooling, right? Everyone is required by law to go to school. Now, is it 18, 19? I can't remember. But how is a compulsive system of scoring where you teach students how to live in a free society? I could put democratic society, but really it's about living in a free society. And that's a big question, I think. So it's very interesting that as the Nazis took over Germany, Germany was understood to be a society where education across the population, looking at literacy rates and all these things, was quite high. And yet they succumbed to the Nazi Party. Okay. And then there's this question of progress in banks. Are we making progress? So I think it may have a little bit to do with your perspective. For me, my perspective is from living in a segregated society to the society we live in today. And so I would argue to a certain degree we've made tremendous progress. But then have we? And I think it's an open question. But I think the progress we've made is that we have better teachers. If you think about the nature of what happened to schooling for African American students after desegregation, and the greatest crime of rapid desegregation was the loss of Black teachers, because students were put in quote unquote into the white schools. Most of the Black teachers were let go, and the white teachers did not look upon their Black students in the same way as their Black teachers did. And it has taken Um, I would suggest at least 2 generations. For now, we have teachers that look, we have more, you know, many of our teachers, most of our teachers, um, do look upon all of their students um, in 2 ways. A, as if they have souls, right, as human beings. B, that they have the potential to learn and are willing to do the things they need to do to help them. So in that sense, I think we've made progress. I don't I don't use measures like high stakes testing as measures of progress. Um, I think they are recessive. I don't think they move us to progress. So, and in many ways, you know, one could argue we don't have progress because dropout rates are still quite high. Um, the rate of students going into college has stayed fairly constant. Um, and so you know, by these measures, one wonders. But I do think we've definitely made progress in who our teachers are. Has it yet to translate? I think teachers are constrained by the systems to a great extent. Um, there's a book I pay attention to a little bit called The Imperfect Panacea, American Faith in Education, 1865 to 1965. The author is H.J. Perkinson. And this is a quote. And of course, a panacea is you know, the optimal solution to all of our problems. So we often put forward school as the way to fix all of our social and economic ills. And what's clear is that is not happening. And so Perkinson says, after the Civil War, the nation, America, gave the school even more complex responsibilities. And he argues that up to the Civil War, we were achieving many of the ends. School was achieving many of the ends, but there were a lot of other factors that helped out. Schooling begins to fundamentally change in and around the Civil War. Civil War is the demarcation. It actually began beforehand and rapidly moved afterwards, where schools were no longer localized. Schools became state run. Horace Mann is the chief architect of that. And there was, even in Massachusetts, where he reformed education, there was a lot of resistance to the state taking over the operations of schools. Ferguson continues, the school was to become the panacea for all social problems. He says a bit later, the school failed to solve the multiple problems generated by urbanization, industrialization, emancipation, and nationalization. He says, in fact, schools actually aggravated these problems. I have an example from Europe. So I did my dissertation on a couple of chapters of my dissertation was looking at schools in the Austrian Republic after the fall of the Habsburg dynasty, right? And it was a progressive education system that was instituted. It was a polytechnic. So they were trying to, so it was to the large extent it was Marxist. They wanted to create social equity. Okay. And when researchers from Columbia University, Teachers College, went to Austria to see what they were achieving, what they found is that nothing really had changed. The social structure as it existed prior continued to exist. It didn't solve any problems. The upshot of that is that schools generally reinforce the social hierarchy. Okay. That's a kind of truism. And so, and what gets privileged, the type of work, I should say, that gets privileged in a school is part of the reason that gets reinforced. Okay. So this is a challenge, I think. Okay. So a couple of things. Clearly, Banks is calling for us to meet our students where they are, which I totally agree. And what I've discovered, or I've become more aware of, is that poverty is the real challenge, more so than any of the other factors. And how do we overcome the effects of poverty on students? And we'll be doing some readings on that. Alghamdi is his five dimensions of multicultural education. And some of these we're going over, but what I've done is, some of this is repetitive, but what I've done is kind of identified Alghamdi's dimensions with the threefold tool of education. Okay. So content integration, culturally responsive teaching is one of his answers. But I think knowing students' natures. So remember the threefold tool is nature, art, and exercise. Okay. So, and this is, Harvey talks about knowing your students' natures. In my piece. Number two, knowledge construction. And here I'm talking about art as in nature art and exercise, not fine arts. Art needs to be less methodical. This is my interpretation of Alghamdi. Art needs to be, the subject structures need to be less methodical, more situational, right? So we're returning to Aoki, situational praxis. Remember what Aristotle says. This is a quote from the Harvey reading. All learning moves from the known to the unknown. Okay. All learning leads from the known to the unknown. Teachers cannot assume prior knowledge for any of their students. Teachers cannot assume prior knowledge for any of their students. Okay, that's number one. Teachers must rethink what is basic knowledge or what is a simple fact. Okay. And this actually is part of my dissertation. This idea of what is basic or what is simple. What is generally what we think of what is basic or what is simple is what we've become accustomed to, right? What comes naturally. Okay. What we've what we've internalized, made automatic. That's why it's so important to have fluency in math, for instance. So students don't have to think about their numbers and necessarily think about addition and subtraction and multiplication. Okay. Because then that becomes basic. So it's easier to do higher level math if all this is basic. Same with language. Same with grammar and punctuation rules. It's easier to write if all that is automatic. Okay, and even symbolism. Okay, but we have less and less the types of symbolism that is environmental, right? Part of our media and everyday isn't the kind of symbolism that shows up necessarily in the literature we have them read. Okay. So prejudice reduction is number 3. And here I go back to Harvey's warning not to assume who your students are, to assume too much about their natures, to understand that often a student is smarter than his teacher. Okay. And here again, teachers need to meet their students where they are at any given moment. And that could change depending on students, right? We certainly know that one day a student can be fine in class, and the next day they could be agitated for some reason. Okay. Equity pedagogy is the 4th dimension. Here we must differentiate our instruction. Okay. We got to know where our students are. And again, back to not assuming they have prior knowledge. Okay. And to teach from the local. And here I refer to Aoki's situational praxis. Okay. We can't just teach from a script, I guess, and able to achieve any of these ends. Finally, empowering school culture, supporting and advocating for students beyond the classroom, moving students to act, education out of the classroom and into the community. And I relate this to exercise, the 3rd part of the threefold tool. Applying what they learn in school into their communities. Okay. So this is, that's it for this second video. I hope I kept it down to about 30 minutes. I'll be working on a few others over this weekend and early next week.